The evening was supposed to be special. The restaurant was one of the most respected in the city, famous for its polished wooden tables, soft golden lights, and quiet background music that made every guest feel important. The CEO had chosen this place carefully. He wanted everything to be perfect, because tonight was not just dinner. It was about building trust with a group of German investors who could take his company to the next level. The CEO entered the restaurant wearing a tailored suit, his shoes polished until they shone. His assistant walked slightly behind him, holding a folder with documents, schedules, and notes about the meeting. The other members of his team were already waiting at the reserved table near the large window. The CEO gave them a quick nod as he joined them. He was a man who valued time, and he expected every detail to run smoothly. The German investors arrived a few minutes later. They were polite, professional, and spoke with quiet confidence. They greeted the CEO with firm handshakes and polite smiles. The first moments went well. Everyone took their seats, and the waiter brought glasses of water and a basket of warm bread. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary business dinner. But beneath the surface, there was a quiet pressure that everyone at the table could feel. The CEO looked around the table and smiled, but inside his mind he was already thinking about the challenges. He knew the investors preferred to speak German. They understood English, but not perfectly, and for business discussions, people always felt more comfortable in their own language. The CEO, unfortunately, had no knowledge of German beyond a few common words. His team was not much better. Some knew how to say thank you or good morning, but nothing more. At the beginning, it didn't seem like a problem. The conversation was polite and formal. They spoke slowly, using English where possible, trying to be clear. But then the menus arrived. They were thick, leather-bound books filled with beautifully written descriptions of dishes, entirely in German. The CEO flipped through the pages, scanning words he couldn't understand. His assistants did the same, some frowning, some pretending to read carefully, but nobody dared to admit they were lost. The German investors, on the other hand, looked comfortable. They began discussing the menu in their own language, pointing at items, commenting with small smiles. The CEO sat quietly, trying to guess from their expressions if they were talking about appetizers or main courses. He felt a slight sting of discomfort. He was the host, yet he couldn't even guide his guests through the first step of the evening, ordering dinner. The waiter stood patiently, pen in hand, waiting for someone to begin. But nobody from the CEO's side moved. A heavy silence fell over the table. The CEO cleared his throat and gave a small laugh, pretending the situation was light, but inside he felt his patience tighten. He didn't like feeling powerless, especially in front of potential partners. He tried to break the silence. With a forced smile, he pointed at a random item on the menu and said, "I'll have this one." The waiter nodded politely but didn't seem entirely sure. The investors looked at him, then at each other. They weren't rude, but their eyes carried a question. Was this really the man leading the company they might invest in? The CEO's assistants followed his lead, each awkwardly pointing to something on the menu. Some whispered to each other, guessing what dishes might be, but the truth was obvious. They didn't know what they were ordering. The investors kept speaking in German among themselves, and slowly the atmosphere started to change. What began as polite respect turned into a quiet gap between the two groups. The CEO noticed it. He was experienced enough to read body language, and he could see the hesitation in their eyes. Business partnerships were built not only on numbers and presentations but also on confidence. Tonight, confidence was slipping away, one untranslated menu at a time. As the first round of drinks arrived, the CEO forced himself to smile and lead the conversation in English again. He spoke about the company's vision, about opportunities for expansion, about shared goals. The investors listened politely, nodding at the right moments, but something was missing. The energy around the table wasn't flowing as it should. It was as if a wall had been built, invisible but strong, and nobody knew how to climb over it. The CEO tapped his fingers lightly on the table. He hated this feeling. He had built his career on control, on being prepared for every situation, on never looking weak. Yet here he was, at one of the most important dinners of his life, struggling because of something as simple as language. He tried to remind himself to stay calm, but his patience was thinning. The waiter returned to take final orders, and once again, the investors spoke quickly in German, smiling and laughing softly among themselves. The CEO's team, meanwhile, grew quieter and quieter. Each one felt the awkwardness. No one wanted to look at the CEO directly, because they could sense his frustration growing. The CEO leaned back in his chair, forcing a polite smile while inside he thought, "This can't go on. We're losing them before we've even started." He looked around the table, hoping someone on his team might suddenly reveal hidden German skills, but of course, no one did. The pressure was becoming unbearable. And just a few steps away, the waitress who had been quietly serving drinks and bread noticed everything. She moved gracefully between tables, her hands steady, her eyes observant. She could hear the fragments of conversation, the broken English, the fluent German, the awkward silence that filled the gaps. She said nothing, at least not yet. The evening was only beginning, but the CEO already felt trapped. He had come to win trust and respect, but instead, he was fighting embarrassment. If something didn't change soon, the night, and possibly the deal, would end in failure. The menus stayed open on the table, their glossy pages filled with long German words that looked more complicated with every passing second. The CEO tried to stay calm, but the discomfort in his chest kept growing. He glanced at the investors, who were speaking smoothly in their own language, pointing to dishes with ease. Their faces were relaxed, their voices steady. In contrast, his own team looked nervous, their eyes darting between the menu and the investors, as if trying to decode some secret code written in front of them. The CEO cleared his throat, attempting to create a sense of control. "So," he said, "shall we order?" His voice carried confidence, but deep inside, he was worried. His eyes swept across the table. Nobody on his side moved. One of his assistants held the menu upside down for a moment, realizing it too late and quickly flipping it around, cheeks turning red. Another tried to pronounce a word softly under his breath but gave up halfway. The investors, polite as ever, smiled but exchanged glances. They were not mocking, but their silence spoke volumes. They were waiting for the hosts to lead, yet it was clear the hosts were not capable of doing so. The waiter approached, pen ready, standing straight with professional patience. "Bitte," he said politely, encouraging the table to begin. The investors began listing their orders in German, one after another. They didn't even look at the menus much. They knew exactly what they wanted. The waiter scribbled down their requests quickly, nodding in agreement. Then the waiter turned his gaze toward the CEO. For a brief second, the CEO felt like a schoolboy again, caught unprepared in front of a teacher. His mind raced. He could not pronounce any of the dishes correctly. He looked down at the words, long, complex, impossible to guess. His instinct told him to just pick something, anything, and move on. With a tight smile, he pointed at a random line on the page. "This one," he said. The waiter leaned slightly closer, waiting for him to try the word. The CEO hesitated, then mumbled a broken attempt at the dish's name. The waiter, trying not to show confusion, nodded and moved on. The assistants followed in the same awkward manner. One pointed quickly and said, "Same for me." Another whispered, "I'll take this," while avoiding eye contact with the waiter. A third gave up completely and asked, "Is there fish?" "Yes, fish. I'll take fish." The waiter tried to translate the vague requests into proper orders, but it was clear to everyone at the table that the CEO's team had no idea what they were ordering. The investors remained polite, but their posture had shifted. One leaned back in his chair, folding his arms, while another drummed his fingers lightly on the table. They weren't angry, but they were losing confidence. Here was a CEO who claimed to lead a global company, yet he couldn't handle something as basic as ordering dinner in their language. The CEO noticed every detail. He could read their faces like a book. He had seen it happen in boardrooms before. A flicker of doubt, a pause too long, a glance exchanged. Those little signals meant one thing. The investors were questioning his authority. The conversation after the ordering became more strained. The CEO tried to lead with small talk, asking about their flight, about Germany's weather, about the economy. The investors answered politely in English, but the rhythm was broken. They spoke in short sentences, avoiding complex thoughts. Then, between themselves, they slid back into German, speaking freely, even laughing at small jokes the CEO's team couldn't understand. The CEO felt his stomach twist. He wasn't used to being the outsider. In his own city, in his chosen restaurant, at his own table, he was supposed to be the host. But somehow, the roles had reversed. The investors were comfortable, while he and his team were stumbling in the dark. His assistant leaned toward him and whispered, "Should we, maybe ask if they want us to order in English?" The CEO shot him a sharp look. That would only expose their weakness even more. He shook his head. "No," he muttered. "Just let it go." The waiter returned with bread refills and wine suggestions. He asked a question in German, looking directly at the CEO. The investors nodded eagerly, but the CEO froze for a split second. He didn't understand a word. He forced a smile and said, "Yes, yes, that's fine." The waiter hesitated, then nodded, though the CEO could tell from his eyes that he wasn't sure what yes referred to. By now, the investors were noticing every little misstep. They weren't unkind, but they were business people. They read situations quickly. And what they were reading now was not impressive. They saw a host who was struggling. They saw a team that lacked preparation. And in the world of business, impressions mattered more than anyone liked to admit. The CEO leaned back in his chair, trying to appear calm. He sipped his water slowly, but his jaw tightened. He thought to himself, how could something so small, so simple, turn into such a problem? This is not about food. This is about respect. If they leave here tonight thinking we are unprepared, the deal is dead before it begins. His assistants avoided his eyes. They felt the same pressure, but they didn't dare speak. The air at the table had changed. What was supposed to be a warm, welcoming evening had turned cold and awkward. Every passing minute felt heavier. The CEO adjusted his tie and forced another smile. "Well," he said, "let us toast to a successful evening." He raised his glass, and the others followed. Glasses clinked gently, but the sound felt hollow. There was no true cheer behind it. For the investors, the unexpected problem was not just about the menu. It was about whether this CEO and his team were ready for an international partnership. And for the CEO, the problem was becoming unbearable. He could feel the dinner slipping out of his control, and with it, the opportunity he had worked so hard to create. And still, the waitress, moving quietly from table to table, noticed it all. She saw the frustration in the CEO's face, the confusion of his team, the quiet laughter of the investors. She carried herself calmly, but inside she knew something. She could help. For now, she stayed silent. The time was not yet right. The night had only just begun, and already the gap between the two groups had grown wide. The unexpected problem wasn't just the menu, it was the wall that language had built, a wall that threatened to end the evening before it truly started. The food orders were finally taken, but the mood at the table did not improve. The German investors continued their quiet conversations in their own language, their voices smooth and confident. They laughed lightly at a small joke, and the CEO's team forced polite smiles, pretending to share in the humor even though they had no idea what had been said. The CEO tried to guide the evening back to business. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wooden table, and began to speak in his usual strong tone. "Our company has been growing rapidly," he said, "and we believe this partnership could open doors to Europe." His words were clear, but the investors only nodded slowly, their expressions polite yet distant. Normally, when the CEO spoke about business, he commanded the room. People listened carefully, taking notes, eager to catch every idea. But tonight was different. He could feel his words floating in the air and falling flat, as if no one wanted to catch them. The investors' eyes drifted back to each other, then to their wine glasses, and sometimes back to the menus they had already closed. The CEO felt invisible. Inside, his frustration began to rise. He hated this loss of control. He was used to being the smartest person at the table, the one others looked to for guidance. But tonight, he felt like a man stranded on an island, waving his arms while everyone else sailed past without noticing. His team sat stiffly, their hands folded neatly on the table, afraid to speak. They could sense his growing anger and didn't want to make it worse. The waiter arrived with the drinks. Tall glasses of wine were placed gently on the table, and the rich red liquid caught the glow of the lights. The investors smiled, lifting their glasses in a small toast in German. The CEO raised his glass too, forcing a grin, but he felt the sting of being excluded. Even a simple toast had become another reminder of the barrier between them. He tried again. "Tell me," the CEO said, addressing the man sitting across from him, "what excites you most about this partnership?" The question was good, simple, and direct. But the investor hesitated, looking to his colleague before answering slowly in broken English. His words were careful, almost too careful, as if each one had to be pulled out with effort. Halfway through, he slipped back into German, finishing his thought more naturally. The others laughed lightly at what he said, but the CEO understood nothing. Heat rose to the CEO's face. He tapped his fingers against his glass to stop himself from snapping. He wanted to shout, "This is my meeting, my city, my company. You should be listening to me." But instead, he gave another tight smile and nodded as if he understood. His assistants quickly scribbled notes, pretending they had caught the meaning, but their eyes betrayed the truth. Minutes passed, and the frustration deepened. The CEO tried to explain the company's new product, but without energy in the room, his words sounded hollow. The investors whispered among themselves, translating parts to each other in German, while he sat there, powerless. Every second felt like sand slipping through his fingers. He was losing them. The silence that followed was worse than any argument. The clinking of glasses from other tables, the soft music in the background, even the faint sound of a plate being set down somewhere else. It all seemed louder than the conversation at his own table. His chest tightened. He looked at his team, but they looked down, pretending to study their notes. No one wanted to meet his eyes. The CEO's patience, already thin, was breaking. He was a man who prided himself on preparation. Yet here he was, stumbling over something so basic. He thought of the weeks of planning, the presentations, the endless meetings leading up to this dinner. All of that hard work was being undone by a simple truth. They could not speak the same language. He tried one last desperate attempt to lighten the mood. With a forced chuckle, he said, "I must confess, German menus are tougher to understand than German business regulations." He expected at least a polite laugh, but the investors only smiled faintly, unsure of his meaning. The joke failed. His heart sank. Now he wasn't just frustrated, he was embarrassed. He could feel the investors' quiet judgment, even if they never spoke it aloud. He could see their doubt building, brick by brick, as clearly as if they were building a wall between him and them. His jaw tightened, his shoulders stiffened, and his smile grew thinner and thinner until it looked more like a grimace. The waiter returned, balancing a tray of appetizers. He placed small plates on the table, announcing each dish in German. The investors nodded happily, but the CEO stared at his plate, unsure of what it was. He picked up his fork and knife, but inside he was boiling. This wasn't just about food anymore. It was about dignity, about power, about respect. He cut into his dish slowly, trying to maintain his composure. His mind raced. If they leave tonight thinking I cannot even manage a dinner, how will they ever trust me to manage millions in investments? The thought made his blood run hot. His patience was gone, replaced with a growing anger he struggled to hide. The investors chatted casually, enjoying their meal, while the CEO chewed in silence. Every bite tasted bitter, not because of the food, but because of the situation. He had planned for everything, except this. Across the room, the waitress who had been quietly serving other tables paused for a moment, watching. She had seen this kind of scene before. Powerful men brought low by something small and unexpected. She could hear the tension in the air as clearly as the music playing softly in the background. She continued her work, but in her mind, She knew it was only a matter of time before the breaking point arrived. And for the CEO, that moment was coming fast. His frustration had reached its peak. He was seconds away from losing his patience completely, and once that happened, the dinner would be ruined beyond repair. The restaurant was alive with soft chatter, clinking glasses, and the quiet sound of cutlery touching plates. But at the CEO's table the tension sat heavy like a thick cloud. Everyone at that table could feel it. The growing gap between host and guests, the way smiles seemed forced, the way sentences stopped halfway. The CEO's patience was stretched thin. His team sat stiff like statues, and the German investors carried on politely but with a quiet distance. Among all this, there was one person who noticed everything without saying a word, the waitress. She moved through the restaurant with calm steps, her tray balanced perfectly on her hand, her face carrying a soft and professional smile. But behind her calm expression, her eyes were sharp. She saw details most people missed. She saw how the CEO gripped his glass tighter each time the investors switched back into German. She noticed the way his assistants lowered their eyes, pretending to study their notes whenever the silence grew too long. She even caught the faintest twitch in the CEO's jaw whenever he felt his authority slipping. For her, it was almost like watching a play unfold. The actors were dressed in fine suits, speaking in half-finished sentences, hiding their nervousness behind polite laughter. But she could sense the truth underneath. It was not a relaxed dinner, it was a battle. And right now, the CEO was losing. She passed by their table several times, refilling glasses of water, offering more bread, clearing plates. Each time she approached, the air felt heavier. The investors' German words floated across the table like a secret code, and the CEO's team tried to smile and nod as though they understood. The waitress could understand perfectly. German was her second language. She had studied it for years, and it flowed in her mind as easily as English. But she kept this fact hidden, her lips sealed, because this was not her moment to speak. She remembered her training: never interfere, never draw unnecessary attention to yourself. A good waitress blended into the background, present but invisible, helpful but quiet. And so she played her role well, bowing her head slightly, keeping her movements graceful, pretending she only knew enough German to take food orders. But inside, she felt a pull. She could see the CEO's growing frustration, almost like heat radiating from him. His words in English sounded strong, but his eyes betrayed him. They were restless, scanning the table, searching for control he could not find. The investors weren't unkind, but their expressions carried a subtle doubt. And the waitress knew exactly why. It wasn't about the menu anymore. It wasn't even about the conversation. It was about respect. When two groups meet, language becomes a bridge. Without that bridge, people stand on opposite sides of the river, waving but never truly connecting. She had seen it happen before. Business dinners that began with promise but ended in disappointment. All because the two sides could not speak to each other fully. She wanted to step in. Her tongue burned with the desire to speak German, to show them all that she could smooth the conversation with just a few words. But still she waited. Timing was everything. If she spoke too soon, she might embarrass the CEO in front of his guests, making him look even weaker. If she spoke too late, the dinner might already be ruined. So she stayed silent, hovering like a shadow at the edge of the table, observing, listening, waiting. The investors ordered another round of wine. As she poured it into their glasses, she listened quietly to their conversation. They were not cruel. In fact, they admired the CEO's vision. But they whispered doubts too. One of them muttered, "If they cannot even manage this dinner, how will they manage cross-border projects?" The waitress understood every word. She lowered her eyes quickly, pretending she hadn't heard, but her heart beat faster. The CEO had no idea of the storm building just across from him. She moved to another table, serving a family celebrating a birthday, then returned with plates for the CEO's group. She placed each dish carefully in front of them, bowing slightly as she did. The investors thanked her politely in German, while the CEO simply nodded, forcing a smile. She caught the flicker of his frustration again. It was like watching a fire grow slowly but surely, one spark away from bursting into flames. She respected the CEO, even admired him from a distance. She had seen his face in magazines, read about his company's success in the business section of newspapers. He was a man known for power and control. Yet here, tonight, he looked almost helpless, trapped by something as simple as words. The contrast fascinated her. As she cleared empty bread baskets and replaced them with fresh ones, she asked herself, should I help? Should I risk breaking my role just to ease the tension of this table? She thought about her job. She was just a waitress, not a translator, not a negotiator. Nobody expected her to step in. Yet something inside her insisted that she couldn't stand by forever. She returned to the service station, folding napkins and pretending to be busy, but her mind stayed on that table. She had seen the investors' doubt grow bigger, seen the CEO's patience shrink smaller, and she knew what was coming. If nothing changed, this dinner would collapse. The investors would leave with polite smiles but no intention of partnership, and the CEO would leave with anger burning inside him. The waitress sighed softly to herself. She wasn't someone who liked drama, but she believed in timing, in small acts that could change everything. She knew that sometimes help came from the most unexpected places. And tonight, maybe she was that place. For now, she stayed quiet, her eyes returning to the CEO's table every few minutes. She was the silent observer, watching the storm gather, knowing she had the power to clear the skies with just a few words, but also knowing that the moment to do so had not yet come. The tension at the CEO's table was now impossible to ignore. The air felt heavy, like a storm was waiting to break. The German investors were still polite, their posture straight, their smiles controlled, but their eyes carried distance. They leaned closer to one another, whispering in German, laughing softly at small jokes, and leaving the CEO's team on the outside. The CEO's face had grown tighter. His smile looked forced, his jaw clenched as though he was holding back sharp words. He stirred his wine glass slowly, staring at the liquid inside as if it might give him the right answer. His team remained stiff and silent, avoiding his eyes. Each of them knew that nothing they could say would help. They were stuck, and the CEO's patience was almost gone. The waitress, who had been watching quietly for so long, felt her heart quicken. She had waited, listening and observing, but she could sense that this was the moment. If she stayed quiet any longer, the dinner would sink completely. The investors would walk away with doubt carved into their minds, and the CEO's pride would shatter in front of them. She approached the table carrying another basket of bread and a small tray of wine refills. Her steps were steady, her face calm, but inside, she was making a decision that could change everything. She placed the bread gently on the table, poured the wine carefully, and when the silence stretched too long, she took a small breath and finally spoke. In perfect, smooth German, she said to the investors, "I couldn't help noticing that you might want some recommendations from the menu. There are a few dishes here that are truly worth trying." The effect was immediate. The investors froze mid-conversation, their eyes widening in surprise. The words were flawless, not just correct, but natural, like someone who had grown up with the language. The CEO's team sat up straight, their mouths slightly open in shock. Even the CEO himself blinked, as if he wasn't sure he had heard correctly. The investors quickly turned their attention to her. One of them asked in German, "You speak our language?" His tone was astonished but warm, almost grateful. The waitress smiled politely, her voice still calm. "Yes," she replied in German. "I studied it for many years. If you would like, I can help explain the dishes, or translate anything to make your evening easier." The table erupted with relief. The investors laughed, delighted, clapping their hands softly on the table. One of them leaned back in his chair and shook his head, saying, "We did not expect this." Their voices, which had sounded reserved before, now carried energy and friendliness. They began asking her about the menu, about the wines, even about her own background. She answered every question with ease, her German rolling smoothly, her tone warm and respectful. The CEO sat frozen for a moment, his mind catching up to what had just happened. Then slowly, he leaned back, his tense shoulders loosening. He didn't say a word at first, but his eyes followed every move of the waitress as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. The investors began pointing at menu items again, but this time, the waitress explained each dish in detail. She described the flavors, the way the meals were prepared, the perfect wine pairings, all in fluent German. She even added small, thoughtful touches, like recommending the dish that reminded her of a traditional German recipe. The investors were charmed. They laughed with her, nodded eagerly, and placed their orders with full confidence. The CEO's team exchanged looks of amazement. A few of them almost smiled for the first time that night, their relief visible. The embarrassing silence that had hung over the table was gone, replaced with energy and comfort. The room seemed lighter, as though someone had opened a window and let fresh air rush in. For the investors, the evening suddenly felt warm and welcoming. They had arrived thinking it would be a stiff business dinner, but now they felt understood, respected, and even cared for. Their voices grew louder, their laughter more frequent. The doubts that had crept into their minds earlier began to melt away. The CEO finally spoke, turning to the waitress. His voice was calmer now, softer, but still carrying authority. "You speak German perfectly," he said in English, almost as if confirming to himself that it was true. She smiled gently. "Thank you, sir. I am happy to help." The investors jumped in quickly, praising her in German, complimenting her accent, saying how rare it was to hear someone outside their country speak with such fluency. She answered modestly, never boasting, always respectful, and yet every word she spoke built a bridge across the table. The CEO watched in silence for a long moment, his mind racing. Just half an hour earlier, he had been on the edge of losing everything. His patience, his respect, maybe even the deal. And now, this young woman, this waitress who had been invisible all night, had stepped in and changed the course of the evening with nothing but her voice. He felt something he wasn't used to feeling: humility. Power had always been his weapon, control his shield, but here he had been powerless. And someone far outside the boardroom had saved him. The table soon filled with laughter and easy conversation. The investors asked the waitress to recommend wines, and they toasted happily. The CEO managed a genuine smile at last, leaning back in his chair, the weight on his chest finally lifting. His team breathed easier, some even joining the conversation now that the atmosphere was safe again. The waitress excused herself after a while, bowing slightly, returning to her other tables. But the change she left behind remained. The storm that had threatened to ruin the evening was gone. In its place, a warmth spread across the table, pulling everyone closer together. The CEO watched her walk away, still stunned. He had entered the evening prepared with numbers, presentations, and strategy. Yet in the end, it was not numbers or strategy that saved him. It was the courage of a quiet observer, stepping forward at the perfect moment to break the silence. The table that had once felt like a battlefield was now slowly transforming into a place of comfort. The investors leaned back in their chairs, smiling more freely. Their voices were no longer guarded or stiff but warm, lively, and full of ease. They spoke in German to the waitress, laughing when she joked lightly about which dish was the most dangerous to try for first-timers. Her timing was perfect, her tone polite but friendly, and each word she spoke seemed to melt away the heavy wall that had divided the two sides. The CEO noticed the change immediately. Only half an hour earlier, he had been drowning in frustration, fighting to keep control of the evening. Now, as he glanced at the faces of the investors, he saw something completely different. Their eyes were no longer filled with doubt but with interest. They leaned in, they nodded more eagerly, and they looked genuinely relaxed for the first time since they sat down. Food began arriving at the table, steaming plates set down with care. The investors smiled and spoke in German, commenting on the flavors, the portions, the presentation. This time, the waitress translated quickly, turning their comments into English so the CEO and his team could follow along. Her words bridged the gap so smoothly that it felt as if there had never been a language barrier at all. The CEO's assistants finally relaxed too. They had been silent and stiff earlier, their fear of embarrassing themselves keeping their mouths shut. But now they smiled cautiously, joining in the lighter parts of the conversation when the waitress translated. For the first time that night, the team didn't look defeated. They looked like part of the evening again. The investors began asking the waitress about her life. "Where did you learn German so well?" one of them asked, his eyes shining with genuine curiosity. She answered with a modest smile. "I studied it at university, and I practiced with German friends. I always loved the sound of the language." They nodded with appreciation, complimenting her on her accent and fluency. They even teased that she spoke better German than some of their younger colleagues back home. The whole table laughed, and even the CEO couldn't stop a small, genuine smile from breaking across his face. The CEO watched carefully, not speaking too much but taking in every detail. It amazed him how quickly the atmosphere had changed. Minutes ago, the investors' laughter had felt like something distant, something he wasn't part of. Now, the sound filled the table, pulling everyone into the same rhythm. It was as if the simple act of communication had unlocked a door, and behind it was a room full of trust and warmth. He raised his glass once more, this time without force, and the investors eagerly joined him. The toast was made in both English and German, the waitress smoothly switching between the two, and the sound of clinking glasses carried more meaning than before. It was no longer hollow. It was genuine. As the meal continued, the CEO felt the tension leave his body. He even began to joke lightly, careful but confident, and the investors laughed with him. It wasn't the kind of laughter that was forced out of politeness. It was real. The waitress, moving quietly in and out of the conversation, made sure that every word was understood, every joke translated, and every idea shared clearly. She didn't dominate the table, but she guided it, gently steering the evening toward harmony. One investor leaned toward the CEO now, speaking in English with more comfort than before. "Your company has great vision," he said, smiling warmly. "We are excited to hear more." The CEO's chest lifted with relief. That sentence, simple as it was, meant everything. The doubt he had seen in their eyes earlier was gone. In its place was interest, perhaps even admiration. And it wasn't just because of the numbers or the strategy. It was because the investors now felt respected, understood, and valued. The CEO turned his gaze briefly toward the waitress as she moved away to serve another table. He watched her carry plates with the same grace she had shown all evening, her face calm, her steps careful. She had returned to being part of the background, yet he knew she had been the most important part of the night. Without her, the mood would never have turned. The investors began asking more questions about the business, this time with genuine enthusiasm. They wanted to know about future plans, possible expansions, and potential collaborations. The CEO answered confidently now, his frustration replaced with calm assurance. Every answer he gave was supported by nods and smiles. By dessert, the mood had completely shifted. Plates of sweet pastries and chocolate were placed on the table, and the investors were laughing so freely it was hard to believe this was the same group from an hour ago. They shared stories about their families, about funny experiences during their travels, even about small mistakes they had made when learning English. The CEO's team laughed along, and the investors no longer looked like distant, unapproachable guests. They looked like friends. The waitress returned one final time to ask if anyone wanted coffee. The investors joked with her in German again, teasing one another about who would be able to sleep after drinking coffee so late. She smiled and joined in, answering with quick wit that made everyone laugh even harder. The CEO shook his head softly in amazement. It struck him then how fragile moments like these were. A dinner that had been sinking fast was now floating smoothly toward success, and the difference came down to one person stepping forward at the right moment. He realized that leadership didn't always mean standing at the front and commanding the room. Sometimes, leadership meant giving space for someone else to shine, even if that someone was a quiet waitress in a restaurant. The investors leaned back, satisfied with the meal, their doubts forgotten. The CEO sat straighter now, his confidence restored, but his heart carried a new lesson. The evening had turned not because of power or wealth but because of respect, humility, and the courage of a silent observer who had chosen the perfect moment to break the silence. The dinner was slowly coming to an end. Plates had been cleared, wine glasses were half empty, and the soft music in the background filled the pauses between conversations. The German investors looked relaxed now, their jackets unbuttoned, their laughter warmer, their smiles wider. The CEO sat quietly for a moment, watching the scene in front of him. He had spent years in boardrooms, giving speeches, presenting numbers, leading teams. Yet tonight, he felt something different, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes following the waitress as she moved gracefully between tables. She was busy serving other guests now, but he could still hear the echo of her fluent German in his head. Her voice had been calm, confident, and steady, and with it, she had changed the entire direction of the evening. He knew it. Everyone at the table knew it. For the first time in years, the CEO felt humbled. He was a man who built his reputation on being prepared for everything. He was the one people turned to in moments of doubt. His company existed because of his bold decisions, his vision, and his discipline. But tonight, none of that mattered. All his experience, all his power, had been useless against one simple problem: a language barrier. And the person who saved him was not a high-paid consultant, not a trusted advisor, not even one of his own executives. It was a waitress. The thought made him pause. He looked down at his hands resting on the table, strong hands that had signed million-dollar contracts and directed massive projects. Yet tonight, those same hands had trembled slightly when he couldn't even order dinner with confidence. He felt a strange mix of emotions: gratitude, embarrassment, and a quiet respect that grew stronger with every passing minute. As the investors continued chatting with his team, the CEO allowed his mind to wander. He thought about leadership. For years, he had believed that leadership meant control, being the one who always had the answers, the one who solved the problems before anyone else noticed them. But tonight, leadership had come from somewhere unexpected. It hadn't been about control at all. It had been about courage, the courage of someone who was technically invisible in the room, stepping forward to do what was needed when nobody else could. He realized then how often leaders overlook the quiet people around them: the receptionist who notices small details, the assistant who keeps everything running smoothly, the server who works long hours to make strangers feel welcome. They might not carry important titles, but they carried something else: the power to make a difference in moments that truly mattered. The CEO felt a sting of shame when he thought of how close he had been to losing his patience earlier. He had almost let his frustration destroy the evening. He remembered the tightness in his chest, the burning in his face, the anger that had been ready to explode. If he had snapped, the dinner would have collapsed completely. But the waitress had stepped in at exactly the right moment, not with force, not with authority, but with kindness and skill. That was what had saved him. He glanced at the investors again. They were laughing freely, even sharing personal stories now. One of them was describing a funny mistake he once made on a business trip in France, and everyone at the table laughed, including the CEO. The wall between them was gone, and in its place was something far more valuable than contracts or numbers: trust. The CEO took a slow sip of his wine, letting the rich taste settle on his tongue. He thought about how fragile trust was, how easily it could be broken, and how difficult it was to earn back once lost. Tonight, trust had nearly slipped away from him, but it had been restored, not by strategy, not by a polished presentation, but by a single person daring to use her voice. For the first time that evening, he allowed himself to truly relax. His shoulders loosened, his heartbeat slowed, and a small, genuine smile spread across his face. He wasn't thinking about quarterly reports or future profits. He wasn't planning his next big move. He was simply reflecting on a moment that had reminded him of something important. Leadership isn't about titles, wealth, or power. It's about action, courage, and timing. He made a quiet decision then. If this partnership went forward, he would remember this night, not as the night he impressed investors with his knowledge, but as the night a young waitress showed him a lesson in humility and leadership. He would carry that memory as a reminder that no matter how high he climbed, he should never underestimate the people around him. As dessert plates were cleared away, one of the investors raised his glass and said warmly, "Tonight has been very good. We feel comfortable. We feel welcome." The CEO nodded, smiling sincerely this time. "That means a lot to me," he replied. And he meant it. His eyes drifted once more to the waitress as she disappeared into the kitchen. She would probably never know how much she had changed this evening for him. To her, it might have been just another shift at work, just another table she served. But to him, it was a turning point. The CEO sat back, letting the conversation continue around him. But inside his mind, he was deeply thoughtful. Success, he realized, wasn't always about being the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes, it came from listening. Sometimes, it came from humility. And sometimes, it came from the courage of someone you least expected. The evening finally came to a close. The waiters cleared the last plates, the candles on the table burned lower, and the soft hum of conversations around the restaurant began to fade as guests slowly left. The German investors pushed their chairs back, looking satisfied, their smiles warm and genuine. They shook the CEO's hand firmly, one by one, their eyes carrying none of the doubt that had been there earlier in the night. Instead, there was respect. "Thank you for this dinner," one of them said in clear English. "We enjoyed it very much. We look forward to continuing our talks." Those words meant everything to the CEO. Earlier that night, he had been so close to losing them. The deal could have collapsed before it had even begun. But now the investors were leaving with good impressions, full stomachs, and, more importantly, trust. He smiled back, shook their hands with genuine warmth, and promised, "This is only the beginning." As the investors left the restaurant, the CEO remained at the table for a moment. His assistants gathered their folders and devices, speaking quietly among themselves, but the CEO's mind was elsewhere. He was replaying the evening in his head, the awkward silence, the frustration, the moment when everything had seemed lost, and then the sudden shift when the waitress had spoken. He couldn't deny the truth. She had saved the night. Without her, the investors would have walked out with polite smiles but cold hearts, and the opportunity would have vanished. He knew that in business, first impressions mattered more than contracts, more than presentations, more than anything written on paper. And tonight's impression had been rescued by someone who was never supposed to play a role in it. The CEO stood slowly, slipping his phone into his pocket, and glanced toward the corner of the room. There she was, the waitress, still working, carrying plates for another table, moving with the same grace and focus as before. She looked calm, almost as if nothing unusual had happened that evening. To her, perhaps it was only a small act, just doing what felt right in the moment. But to him, it had been everything. He thought of going over to thank her properly, to tell her how much her courage had meant. But he stopped himself. Part of him felt that no words could fully capture the depth of his gratitude. Another part of him thought that maybe it was better this way. She had stepped in without expecting recognition, and perhaps she didn't need it. Still, he promised himself that he would never forget what she had done. As he walked out of the restaurant into the cool night air, the city lights glowing around him, he felt something unusual, a quiet sense of humility. He had spent years building an empire, surrounded by advisors, analysts, and executives. Yet tonight's lesson had come not from them, but from someone who carried no title, who wore no expensive suit, who was not invited to the table but who had changed its entire course. The car pulled up, and his driver opened the door. The CEO slipped inside, but before the door closed, he looked back at the restaurant one last time. He thought about how leadership sometimes came from the most unexpected places. He thought about how important it was to see people, not just their roles, not just their positions, but their potential. The next day, as he sat in his office high above the city, the night before still fresh in his mind, he found himself speaking differently to his team. He was less sharp, less impatient. He listened more, gave them space to speak, and even asked for opinions he might normally have ignored. His assistants noticed the change but didn't say anything. They only wondered what had softened him overnight. The investors called later that week. Their voices carried excitement and interest. They wanted to move forward, to explore the partnership in detail. The CEO smiled as he hung up the phone, a wave of relief and pride rushing through him. But he also knew the truth. Behind this victory was the quiet courage of a waitress who had chosen the perfect moment to step forward. In the weeks that followed, he carried the memory of that evening with him like a lesson carved into his heart. Whenever he felt frustration rising, he remembered the feeling of sitting at that table, powerless, trapped by silence, until someone unexpected had broken it. Whenever he felt pride swelling too much, he remembered how quickly control could slip away, and how easily someone else could restore it. The story of that night spread quietly among his close circle. His assistants told it to a few colleagues, always with a sense of amazement. "We thought the evening was lost," one of them would say, but then the waitress spoke perfect German, and everything changed. It became almost like a legend inside the company, a reminder that no situation was ever beyond saving, and that help could come from anywhere. For the CEO, it became more personal. He carried it not as a story to impress others but as a reminder to himself. Never underestimate the quiet ones, never dismiss the people in the background, and never forget that leadership is not about always being the loudest voice. Sometimes, leadership is about knowing when to let someone else speak. Years later, whenever he dined in fine restaurants or met with new partners, he often caught himself glancing at the waitstaff, wondering what hidden talents and quiet strengths they might carry. He treated them with more respect than before, not out of politeness but out of genuine belief that greatness could hide in the simplest of roles. And though he never saw that waitress again, her voice, her words, and her courage remained with him. That night had not only saved a deal, it had changed the way he saw people, the way he led, and the way he understood the true meaning of strength. The investors remembered that evening too. In later meetings, they often mentioned how welcome they had felt, how respected. They never knew the struggle that had taken place before the waitress spoke. To them, it had simply been a perfect dinner, warm and well-planned. But to the CEO, it was a memory forever etched into his mind. A night when patience almost broke, when pride almost collapsed, and when salvation came from the most unexpected voice in the room.